the BBC reported this morning that sort of supposedly at least 100 North Koreans have been killed in Ukraine.
I think it's undeniable that we did see democratic institutional resilience at work in South Korea. And this particular martial law decision came against the backdrop of Yoon and his wife, actually the South Korean First Lady, being mired in a variety of domestic scandals. Yoon does not have even a strong base of support within his own party.
What would you recommend viewers, listeners, to really focus on for the next, quarter, or the first things to look out for into the coming year?
One of the places they tell us what they're going to do is at these kinds of party plenums, so that's something to watch out for. One of the big possibilities that I think is flying under the radar is actually the prospect of North Korea trying to seek direct involvement in multilateral settlement talks over Ukraine with the status of a co-belligerent country with the Russians, right? If we do get to a point where NATO, Russia, and Ukraine are sitting down for some kind of talks on the future of a European security architecture, that the North Koreans could look for a slice of that.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going, everybody? So, I'll tell you a story. A couple of weeks ago, there was a time when South Korea's democracy was never under question, and the idea of a coup certainly not, or attempted one at least, being, on the cards, on my bingo card at least, it certainly wasn't there. But I had to add it because a certain President Yoon, or should I say ex-president at this time, of recording, attempted to do something rather bizarre. And that was largely the word that I came round to describe it in my very surface level analysis, which you can find in the description. But as with things like imposter syndrome, I'm now joined by someone who knows the matter much more in depth. So I've already probably made a couple of mistakes there. But at the time of recording, there has been an impeachment. And now we're seeing a transition towards a new leadership and election cycle in South Korea. But this is obviously not just within the borders. It happens across, with potentially opportunistic actions by Beijing and Pyongyang. And how does this all work into the relationship with the incoming Trump administration? All this and more with a returning guest I'm delighted to have back, Ankit Panda, who is the Stanton Senior Fellow in Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie Endowment for Peace, and also the author of New Nuclear Age and Kim Jong-un and the Bomb. So someone you know is well placed to tell us what the heck's going on. Ankit, thank you very much for joining us again. And could you explain to myself and my viewers what's happening exactly? And is President Yoon gone for good?
So it's very likely that this is the end of Yoon Suk-yul's political career. He's not a traditional politician. This was something that I think folks, particularly in the United States, would sometimes cite as a positive because it meant that on the foreign policy portfolio, Yoon was willing to do certain things that other South Korean presidents might have thought a little bit more about, like pursue closer ties with Japan, for instance. But I think that same non-traditionalism obviously manifested in this martial law crisis, which resulted in a dramatic 11-day period between Yoon declaring martial law and 2 impeachment votes, the first of which failed, the second of which succeeded, now resulting in Yoon being temporarily suspended from office. The way it works in South Korea is that there's a period of 6 months under which a constitutional court will review the facts of the impeachment to determine whether or not the impeachment is valid. There's some quirks there because the court is not actually fully seated. There's only 6 out of 9 justices, which is an unprecedented problem. And I'm not a South Korean legal expert, so I won't offer any authoritative takes on how the South Korean constitutional crisis might navigate this particular predicament. But all signs, I think, point to Yoon being out permanently at this point. We have a caretaker president, Han Duck-soo, the former prime minister, who is running the show. But as you indicated, this is a really delicate time for South Korea to be going through a crisis like this when you have a presidential transition playing out in the United States with implications for the alliance. North Korea certainly taking greater risks than it perhaps used to in the past. So I think there's a lot to dig into there.
No, for sure. I want to dig into North Korea a little bit more specifically later. I think there's about 100, the BBC reported this morning that sort of supposedly at least 100 North Koreans have been killed in Ukraine, according to South Korean intelligence. But just, I'm still fascinated almost by what transpired because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I almost see this as a positive that sort of it shows you the strength of South Korean democracy in the institutional framework, right? Obviously, we would prefer it not to happen at all. But like in Brazil, when Bolsonaro attempted to sort of, centralize control, the institutions have firmly shown that Brazilian democracy is very much, one, supported by the Brazilians, but second, was not going to just simply be overhauled. So what does this tell us about the strength of the system and the willingness of many of his own people, party, whatever side to go against him like that?
Yeah, so look, I think it's undeniable that we did see democratic institutional resilience at work in South Korea, but I do want to temper that a little bit, right? Because Yoon Suk-yul was not a popular leader. He wasn't even popular when he won the presidency. He was sort of just, sort of the least bad option in the eyes of the South Korean electorate at the time. Voters weren't particularly enthusiastic about him. His approval ratings were middling throughout his term since 2022. And this particular martial law decision came against the backdrop of Yoon and his wife, actually, the South Korean First Lady, being mired in a variety of domestic scandals. Yoon does not have even a strong base of support within his own party. And so you can see why, against that backdrop, this dramatic martial law decision, which, don't get me wrong, I mean, is an affront to South Korea's liberal democratic system and values, why it wasn't necessarily going to be tenable or primed to succeed in the first place, right? In the days since the martial law declaration, this was a 6-hour period in which Yoon declared martial law, and the South Korean National Assembly voted to overturn that decision. And then since then, there's been a lot of hearings. I think we really see that, from specific commanders in the South Korean armed forces indicating that they weren't willing to follow Yoon's orders, to Yoon not taking any steps to limit the operating of the South Korean press, right? That's sort of coup 101, is you want to get the press on your side, or at least not have the press broadcasting freely or broadcasting messages contrary to your martial law or self-coup goals. This is, I think, best taxonomized as a self-coup attempt. So for all of those reasons, I think, Yoon was not very well positioned to actually get away with what he was trying to get away with here. And there's a lot of darker subtext here, too, about a few individuals close to Yoon, including the now ousted Minister of Defense, former Minister of Defense, Kim Yong-hun, who in October tried to essentially stoke a major crisis with North Korea, potentially to provide a pretext for the martial law declaration. Yoon had a rationale, which was that the martial law declaration was necessary because, quote, anti-state forces, by which he meant the Progressive Opposition Party, were collaborating with the North Koreans to destabilize South Korea. And so that was the basis on which martial law was declared. But it was a short-lived affair. South Korean democracy did snap back, and most importantly, the South Korean people, from the progressive side and even conservatives, were outraged by this, and so were publicly protesting. I think at some points you had around 1 million people out in Seoul calling for Yoon's ouster. So that too, I think, speaks to this. And by the way, this is not this is not unprecedented territory for South Korea. This idea of a conservative leader being impeached, this happened in 2016 as well, with former President Park Geun-hye, who was impeached for transgressions that were far more limited, in my opinion, than what Yoon has just tried to do with martial law. But South Korea has been here fairly recently.
Interesting. I didn't know about that in 2016. I've always mainly followed South Korea in the context of sort of East Asia, China, and great power politics, but that's quite notable. So, very simply though, Ankit, what was he thinking? Maybe you've touched upon it, I guess, and I'm not saying you're a psychologist and we can understand what he was attempting to do here, but was this just to protect his reputation, his wife, the transgressions that were done, or was there a deeper seated desire to sort of want to try to centralize control and do a Orban, do a sort of, whatever, strongman attempt at sort of power grabbing, but his platform was never there in the first place, right?
Yeah, so, like I said, Yoon is not a traditional politician. He doesn't understand politics in the way that many of South Korea's traditional lawmakers do. He's a former prosecutor who found himself elected as president. And I think over his time in office, I think he developed a sense of contempt for politics, right? Especially, I think, the corruption allegations against his wife. I think part of what I've been seeing reported in South Korea was that this martial law attempt was also partly a way for Yoon to try to insulate himself and his wife from scrutiny and from potentially ending up behind bars, which, again, is not a fate too unfamiliar to South Korean presidents, right? And so, unfortunately, I think for Yoon and likely his wife, this martial law crisis will result in precisely that outcome. It's rather likely that Yoon, if the Constitutional Court does uphold the impeachment as valid, which is likely at this point, that Yoon will likely be prosecuted and end up behind bars, as will his wife. And so psychologically, I think that's the pretext here, that this was a isolated leader, very much disinterested and contemptuous to a degree of ordinary domestic politics, I think taking rather dramatic steps to try to essentially get things done. But again, I think without fully understanding just the severity of what a martial law declaration would represent, right? I mean, there's broader subtext here too, right? Which is South Korea is a country that transitioned to democracy, I think, far more recently than many people realize, right? This was towards the end of the 1980s. And so for many of a certain age cohort in South Korea today, including folks in their 50s and 60s, the democratization movement and the authoritarian era still linger large, or loom large, and particularly for certain folks on the conservative side of the South Korean political picture, I think there is something of a sense of nostalgia for those authoritarian days, and I think that's partly what we might have seen manifest here with Yoon and those close to Yoon that were involved in the martial law declaration. But South Korea has come a long way, and so Yoon's own party, you had very prominent figures, including the leader of the People Power Party, the Conservative Party, express their outrage and disgust that Yoon would try to impose martial law under these conditions. So I don't mean to imply that it's purely a partisan matter, but I think for the way in which this issue played out, I think that is partly the subtext. And especially for, I think, progressives in South Korea, this is a persistent perception that South Korean conservatives are a lot more comfortable with more authoritarian forms of governing.
Wow, okay. I mean, you do make me think of that very infamous picture that went round of the young girl, I believe, one member of the public just grabbing the assault rifle, the barrel, sort of as a way of protest, but sort of it shows you just how far South Koreans are willing to go to show that they are no longer going to accept what came before, right, in the 1980s. I didn't realize it was that late either. I mean, I was only born in 93, so sort of similar age, I suppose. Wow, so... and also, actually, this is a good segue into the other question I was going to ask you on that. Then we'll circle back to the other point I was going to mention, which was you mentioned progressives. And obviously now there's discussion about what comes next. And there was an article I was reading in the Financial Times yesterday, and they were talking about the opposition leader, who is quite left-wing. Someone called him a firebrand. Could you unpack a little bit who Myung, if I'm saying that?
Myung, yeah.
Who is he?
He ran against, he was the progressive presidential candidate who ran against Yoon and lost in 2022. He continues to lead the Democratic Party. So he's a left-wing populist leader. He's got his own list of scandals and legal troubles that I think are lingering in the background. Myung is presumed to be the candidate that the Democratic Party would put up. The moment that the Constitutional Court confirms the impeachment, we will head into a special election, very similar to what happened again in 2017 after the 2016 impeachment resulted in Park Geun-hye's removal. There was a special election in 2017. And right now, based on how much of the South Korean public is just incensed at the Conservative People Power Party, right? Not just Yoon, by the way, because the second impeachment vote was this important litmus test for the Conservative Party, and only 12 lawmakers were willing to defect and vote against Yoon. It was an anonymous ballot, but I think for the South Korean public, the fact that the Conservative Party was not willing to more openly criticize Yoon and vote against him in impeachment, I think has now basically meant that the tides have swung towards the progressives, and it's likely, barring some kind of dramatic crisis or controversy of some kind, which, don't get me wrong, is entirely possible in South Korean politics, that Myung is going to be well positioned to prevail in a special election. So yeah, I think his views on South Korea's place in Northeast Asia and foreign affairs are interesting. I think they get a little oversimplified in some of the Western reporting, which will occasionally describe him as anti-American and pro-China. That's a bit of an oversimplification, in my opinion. It is, I think, a way in which a lot of Americans try to make sense of progressive conservative divides. I think the better way to think about South Korean progressives is that they have a much stronger bent towards strategic autonomy for South Korea, which I think, from the perception of some in Washington, manifests as being more anti-American and more pro-Chinese. But it is, I think, a different approach to statecraft, and also a lot more pro-engagement towards North Korea. Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, who was in office when President Trump met with Kim Jong-un, for instance, was a progressive, largely cut from the same cloth when it came to thinking of South Korea's role in the region and the world. And so the expectation would be then that Lee Jae-myung would take that approach. The big question mark is how he would do managing Trump. And I think that's where I think a lot of people see a clash of personalities, just given how personality-driven Donald Trump tends to be in his interactions with allies and adversaries of the United States alike.
Yeah, I was going to touch upon that later on, but since we're here, we'll raise it now. So, from what I understand, he is a pretty polarizing figure, and there are some people, I was reading a broader analysis, that he could sort of perpetuate the quote-unquote political revenge cycle in South Korea. I don't know what your sentiment is there, but to tag on to that is also obviously his the predecessor that you mentioned, who met Trump and was sort of quite active during those years with the DMZ and the handshake and such. I don't get the sense that he would be quite as cordial. I get the sense that Lee is going to be more combative in certain areas, right? He's more polarizing in that regard. Is that something therefore you fear? So to speak?
It's difficult to say. I mean, look, Moon Jae-in, before he was elected to the presidency, I think had a similar assessment, right? Because there's a difference between, being a lawmaker in a rowdy democratic polity where, you might say certain things, and then being the person behind the presidential desk. And so when Moon Jae-in became president, he, I think, moderated the ways in which he would talk about the United States and the alliance. I think you're right that Lee Jae-myung is a very different personality, right? So he might not moderate in quite that way, but I do think it's worth at least seeing how the potential presidency might or might not moderate him. And look, I mean, like I said, it's still very contingent. There's a lot of things that have to happen to get us to a President Lee Jae-myung still in South Korea. But based on where I'm sitting now, that series of events does seem the most likely to play out. But things could go in a different direction, right? Which is to say, but. I think with Lee, I think the other big thing to watch for is relations with Japan, right? Because that is where I think you're actually going to see a significant reversal, right? So Yoon, as I said earlier, wasn't an ordinary politician, and one of the advantages for Washington meant that he was very happy to just very openly pursue better ties with Japan, which is not at all popular in South Korea. And so that led to this remarkable kind of surge in trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. The Japanese, throughout that whole process, by the way, were rather careful because they understood that without domestic political buy-in in South Korea, the risk is that the rug gets pulled out from underneath all of this trilateral cooperation. And I think that is precisely what is going to happen now. And meanwhile, in Tokyo, you have Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru, who's actually very pro-South Korea and pro-trilateralism. So you're going to get this kind of phase shift where you're going to have Donald Trump, who's not interested in anything but bilateralism. I mean, if there's anything about his approach to statecraft is that he thinks in bilateral terms. You'll have Ishiba, who's happy to have minilateralism and trilateralism and better ties with South Korea. And you'll potentially have a Democratic Party administration in South Korea that is going to be very, very down on the prospect of collaborating with Japan. And so that is going to be a pretty significant recalibration of this particular Northeast Asian triangle.
I certainly think there's going to be a recalibration, but do you not think that based on what we've seen with Trump, I don't want to overhype it equally, but the sort of, maybe it's overzealous pro-Ukrainian camps who are like, oh, maybe Trump's having reconsiderations. But the point I'm making is that he's installing certain people in certain positions in his upcoming administration that you wouldn't normally expect, which some people are hoping may mean he's more open to supporting Ukraine. The point I'm making is that could we maybe see him being more considerative of engaging in the trilateral approach, because let's be honest, his foreign policy agenda number one largely is China, right? I mean, he wants to get rid of certain NATO, and Ukraine is an issue. He wants to give Israel free reins to do whatever and manage the Middle East. China is his focal point. So if it means that he can work together with two partners, whether or not he cares about alliances and such, could we maybe see a shift in Trump, or you're pretty set that it's going to be just bilateral?
We couldn't. I mean, it's impossible to predict what he will do. I think, look, I think the bigger problem though for the U.S. South Korea alliance is that Yoon, before the martial law crisis, was actually preparing to manage Trump. Right? I mean, he was learning how to play golf. That was essentially his plan to strike up something of a personal relationship
Right.
with the U.S. president. And now you're going to have, in the first few months of the new U.S. administration, a caretaker president in South Korea, and I think that's going to be a potential loss of opportunity for Seoul.
Right.
Which I think would have hoped to communicate to Trump just all of the investments that South Korea is undertaking in the United States to show that South Korea is not a free rider, and to hope that they could get the alliance off to a good start under the new administration in Washington. So,
all right, fair enough. Let's pivot or twist it on its head then. So we've got the pro South Koreans, or those on one side, but on the other side, as I alluded to at the beginning of the sort of introduction, one of the things I was rather curious about was whether or not you might see some kind of opportunism by Beijing, Pyongyang specifically, to interfere, not directly maybe, but just sort of play on the crises, the unusual but rather good opportunity, right? Unique moment. Have we seen any such indications of that, or is Pyongyang focused on supporting Russia and China doesn't want to get involved?
yeah, so it's always a possibility. I mean, my assessment right now is that it's unlikely. The North Koreans have reacted to this. They've called Yoon quote insane over the martial law declaration. They did this again in 2016 when Park Geun-hye was impeached. They broadcast internally inside North Korea footage of South Koreans protesting in the streets, and you might think that for an authoritarian leader like Kim Jong-un, probably not a great idea to show that there's a country out there with Koreans who do have the ability to speak out against their government. But the North Koreans used it as an example of just how dysfunctional South Korean society is. And I think that was the same propaganda play that they attempted to run this time. A big difference between now and 2016, of course, is since then the North Koreans have abandoned the goal of unification with South Korea. Apart from that, I think, though, Kim Jong-un doesn't really, the logic of why North Korea would benefit from a deliberately instigating a crisis just isn't there right now because of everything that Kim has going on with Russia. He's also in the process of he's finishing up his military modernization 5-year plan. And heading into next year, the North Koreans have their own party plenum coming up in just a couple weeks towards the end of the year. And so it's a sensitive time for them domestically as well in North Korea. So all of that, I think, points to the North Koreans making propaganda hay of this, but probably not much more. And then for China, I think, the way in which the Chinese system reacts to these kinds of external shocks is not very quickly, right? I mean, the Chinese take a long time to digest these kinds of events through their own domestic political system before developing any kind of concerted diplomatic or geopolitical strategy. So by the same token, I think China's going to probably take a wait and see approach. I think they'll look to a move away from Yoon as a positive for them, because I think they will see Lee Jae-myung as potentially a lot more open to talking to China on the terms that China might prefer, but also in terms of resisting the impulse that the U.S. pursued with Yoon to make South Korea a lot more outspoken on things like Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific and sort of regional order issues. So I think on both fronts, it's going to be a pretty kind of even-handed sort of approach by both North Korea and China looking at this crisis. I don't think either of them saw this coming or had any kind of assumptions baked into what they would do if Yoon were to declare martial law and stoke a constitutional crisis.
Okay, no, but I mean, symbolically, optically, it's very sort of, they're rubbing their hands gleefully, surely. I think from the Chinese, I want to unpack that a little bit more just because the repercussions of this sizable, I know it's primarily domestically focused, but the $1.4 trillion, I think, worth of fiscal changes and the general loosening up of the monetary policy. Could that have any repercussions for East Asia more broadly, or in South Korea as we enter this sort of turbulent political economic situation?
It's totally look. I mean, I think right now the fiscal picture in South Korea is fairly constant, right? I mean, they're trying to get a new budget through, and you have again a caretaker leader that's walking on eggshells, by the way, because he's been threatened by the opposition to essentially just see through his role as a caretaker without taking any politically risky moves. So very difficult to say overall. I think I think for China in particular, it's really going to be the political transition towards a Democratic Party leader that I think is going to be the most significant outcome of this whole crisis.
Okay. And then I guess the last question for you, really branching very much out, but this is the last time we'll have you before the end of the year. And you always do great sort of, I think, reviews, but also previews of the following year on Asian Geopolitics podcast, which I do always enjoy, which is what would you recommend viewers, listeners to really focus on for the next, quarter, or the first things to look out for into the coming year? Be it
in Northeast Asia?
Korea, or the whole of the East Asian Korean Peninsula region.
Yeah, so I think the big thing to watch for, at least that I'll be watching for, is the North Korean party plenum, which is coming up right at the end of December. That's a really significant event on the North Korean political calendar. It's when Kim Jong-un will identify his strategic priorities for the next year. I always like to say people talk about North Korea as this inscrutable and impossible to understand country, but they actually often tell us what they're going to do and then they do it. And one of the places they tell us what they're going to do is at these kinds of party plenums. So that's something to watch out for. One of the big possibilities that I think is flying under the radar is actually the prospect of North Korea trying to seek direct involvement in multilateral settlement talks over Ukraine with the status of a co-belligerent country with the Russians, right? Because they ultimately are fighting under the auspices of a legally ratified treaty, right? The Russians have ratified the treaty. The North Koreans have ratified the treaty. There is a legal basis for North Korea's participation in the Russia-Ukraine war, which might mean that if we do get to a point where NATO, Russia, and Ukraine are sitting down for some kind of talks on the future of a European security architecture, that the North Koreans could look for a slice of that. And I think that's very much consistent with Kim Jong-un's longstanding
what would that even
geopolitical
look like?
objectives. Totally unprecedented, right? We are fully in uncharted waters if something like that happens. But I just don't think it's out of the realm of the possible, given North Korea's
we get like a maritime base in
ambitions.
Kaliningrad or something.
No, no. All I mean is that the North Koreans would want to have potentially a seat at the table, right? So that actually raises the prospect that the first time you would have diplomatic engagement between the U.S. and North Korea since October 2019 will be in the context of multilateral talks over the conclusion potentially of this European conflict. So that's, I think, one thing I just want to flag for your listeners.
That's really interesting, but also, well, the word I'm going to keep referring in this context then, bizarre. But what about South Korea, North Korea, right? I mean, there is always worry that they're going to do another Fire of Fury, early 2017 sort of vibes. Well, that's what happened in Trump's first few months, right? Are we going to see that?
Yeah, so we don't know if Trump's going to come in and immediately start rewriting love letters to Kim Jong-un, or if North Korea will just completely get ignored. All right, either is a possibility. My hunch is that the North Koreans will take the initiative. They'll do something dramatic, like launch an ICBM into the Pacific, carry out a nuclear test, demonstrate multiple warhead capability. And that will force the United States to then react. It will force Trump to potentially tweet about North Korea. And then that creates the stimulus for potentially some kind of change in how the U.S. and North Korea interact.
Okay, yeah, so it's sort of, we're here, all right, I notice you're here, we want the attention. All right, well, on that rather, shall we say, flamboyant, buoyant note, I'm not sure what best word to use, Ankit, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming back on at this late time in the year. Everyone, if you enjoyed the conversation, then give it a like, consider subscribing, and do check out Ankit's fantastic analysis, as well as the Asia Geopolitics podcast that he does with his co-host in DC. But that's it from me, everyone. And as we like to say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be played. Take care.